At the beginning of last summer, I made a decision that still keeps me awake some nights. I saved the life of something that, based on everything I believed about the natural world, should not exist. What followed reshaped the way I think about wilderness and what may be hidden within it. This isn't about showing off or trying to persuade anyone. It's about what happened in the moment I chose to help a living being that was dying right in front of me. A being with a face that was far too human to ignore. My name is Tom Harris. I've been a forest ranger in northern Montana for 19 years. That's not something I say to impress anyone. It's just context. 19 years means you stop being surprised by the woods. You learn their rhythms. You know which trails flood in spring, which ridgelines catch wind, where the elk bed down in October. The forest becomes a thing you read, like a book you've opened so many times the spine is broken. But there are pages I never got to, not until that day. I live in a small cabin about 12 miles from the nearest town, and even that word is generous. A gas station, a feed store, a church that holds services every other Sunday. I moved here in my late 20s, after a stint in the Army that I won't get into. The quiet suited me. Still does, mostly. That fall, early October, I had a standard patrol scheduled. Trail cameras needed checking. Firewood needed gathering before the first hard freeze. I'd done this run dozens of times. I knew every mile of it. The route took me about 7 miles out into the backcountry and looped back. Half a day's work, tops. I packed light. Water, a small kit, my radio. Signal flares, because that's just what you carry out here. I didn't bring anything else. I didn't think I'd need to. Looking back, I wish I could tell you the exact moment I knew something was wrong. But that's the thing about dread. It doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in so quietly you don't notice it's already there. The morning started normal. Cool air, overcast sky, the kind of gray October light that makes everything look faded. I drove my truck to the trailhead, locked it, and started walking. The first 2 miles were exactly what I expected. Mud, pine needles, the occasional deer track pressed into soft ground. My radio picked up a weak signal from the ranger station. Static, mostly, but enough to know it was working. By mile 3, I was deep enough in that the trees closed overhead and the sky disappeared. This is the part of the route I'd walked 100 times. Nothing here had ever surprised me. Nothing here had ever surprised me. That's what I kept telling myself. And for a while, it was true. I checked the first trail camera around 10 in the morning. Elk, mostly. A black bear passing through 3 nights earlier. Routine footage. I swapped the memory card, noted the timestamp, and moved on. The forest was loud that morning, or at least it was doing what forests do. Birds in the canopy, wind shifting through the upper branches, the crunch of my own boots on the trail. A kind of white noise that, after 19 years, I barely registered anymore. That's why, when it stopped, I noticed immediately. The silence didn't come all at once. That's what made it so unsettling. It wasn't like someone had thrown a switch. It was more like the forest was exhaling, slowly, deliberately, and then simply stopped breathing. I noticed the birds first, mid-sentence almost. One moment there was movement in the canopy above me, the usual chatter of nuthatches and chickadees. The next, nothing. No wings, no calls. Just stillness pressed against the treetops like something heavy had settled there. I told myself it was normal. Animals go quiet sometimes. A predator nearby, maybe. A hawk circling above the cloud cover. I'd seen it before. But then the insects went too. I stopped walking, stood there with one boot half lifted, listening. The kind of listening you can only do when there is absolutely nothing to listen to. No buzz, no hum, no rustle of anything alive moving through the undergrowth. Even the wind, and this is the part that stayed with me long after everything else. Even the wind seemed to pull back. The branches above me hung perfectly, unnaturally still. It was mile 5. I knew this because I'd just passed a marker I carved into a fallen log 3 years back. A small notch, nothing more. A way of keeping track. Something about that silence felt deliberate, like it wasn't an absence of sound, so much as sound being held back, swallowed. I didn't have a word for it then. I still don't, really. I pulled out my radio, pressed the call button. Static. Thick, grinding static that didn't sound like a dead signal. It sounded almost like interference, like something was sitting on the frequency. I tried again. Nothing came through clearly. A fragment of a voice, maybe, or maybe just the static shaping itself into something my brain wanted to hear. I clicked it off and clipped it back to my belt. That's when I looked down at my compass. I'd been carrying the same compass for 11 years. A simple baseplate model, nothing fancy, but reliable, steady. The needle always found north, without hesitation. A small, predictable certainty I'd come to depend on without thinking about it. Now it was drifting. Not spinning wildly. Nothing dramatic. Just a slow, lazy drift to the east. 2 degrees. Then 3. Then back. Like it was tasting the air, searching for something it couldn't find. I tapped the glass, held it flat, waited. It drifted again, 4 degrees this time, settling there, holding. I checked it twice more over the next 10 minutes. Each time it was off. Each time by a little more. I told myself it was a local magnetic anomaly. I'd read about those. Mineral deposits underground, iron in the rock. Perfectly explainable. Except I'd walked this exact trail dozens of times. The compass had never done this here before. I kept moving. What else was going to do? Turn back? I was a ranger. This was my territory. But I walked slower now, and I watched the trail ahead of me, the way you watch a road in fog, carefully, expecting nothing, braced for everything. The first broken marker appeared about 200 yards further on. A wooden post I'd set into the ground 2 seasons back to mark a water source. It wasn't just knocked over. It was snapped, clean through the middle, the upper half thrown several feet off the trail. The break was rough, splintered, like something had grabbed it and twisted. I stood over it for a long time, saying nothing. There was no one to say anything to. That's when I started paying attention to the ground. And that's when I realized the tracks I expected to see, deer, elk, the occasional bear, weren't there anymore. Not a single print. The mud along the trail was smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing living had passed through this stretch in days. Nothing except whatever had broken that post. I found 2 more broken markers over the next quarter mile. Each one snapped the same way, grabbed and twisted, not cut, not weathered. The stone cairns were worse. I'd built 3 of them myself over the years, stacking flat rocks into neat columns to mark trail junctions. 2 of them were completely demolished, rocks scattered wide, some of them thrown far enough that I had to walk off the trail to find them. One boulder, heavy enough that I couldn't have lifted it alone, had been rolled deliberately off the path and into a shallow ravine. I want to be honest about what I felt standing there. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was something quieter than fear. A kind of wrongness settling into my chest, like a note played just slightly out of tune. Everything around me looked familiar, but it didn't feel familiar anymore. The destruction wasn't random. That's what kept pulling my attention back. Random damage looks chaotic. Wind, animals, time. This looked purposeful, deliberate. Something had come through this corridor and systematically taken apart every marker, every cairn, every sign that human beings had been here and known where they were going. I checked my radio again. Nothing. The static was worse now, a low, constant grinding that made me turn it off entirely. The silence that replaced it felt heavier than before. I should have turned back then. A smarter man would have. But I'd been walking these woods for 19 years, and there was a part of me, a stubborn, foolish part, that refused to be frightened off my own trail by broken sticks and scattered rocks. That part of me was about to learn something. I kept moving north, picking my way more carefully now, watching the ground. The trail was beginning to narrow here, squeezed between two ridgelines that rose steeply on either side. The trees were older in this stretch, massive Douglas firs, their trunks dark and scored with age. The canopy was so thick overhead that what little gray light remained barely reached the forest floor. And then I heard it. Not gradually, not building from a distance. It was simply there, close, maybe 60 yards ahead, maybe less. A sound that stopped me mid-step and locked every muscle in my body. A scream. Except it wasn't quite a scream. It was something trying to be one. The sound was raw, damaged, like it was being forced through a throat that wasn't built for it, wet and strained and wrong. But buried inside the distortion, underneath the animal pain of it, was something that made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my jacket. It sounded like a word. Help. Warped, stretched, broken apart and reassembled by a mouth that didn't know how to shape it, but unmistakable once you heard it. Once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, not breathing. My hand had moved to my belt, not to the radio, but to the flare gun. Instinct, old instinct, the kind that doesn't wait for your mind to catch up. I want to tell you I understood what I was hearing. I didn't. Not then. I just knew it was alive, it was close, and it was in pain. The second sound came maybe 10 seconds later. This one I knew. This one I'd heard 100 times in 19 years of walking Montana backcountry, and it never stopped being what it was, the deep, guttural growl of a mountain lion. Close, focused. The sound a cougar makes not when it's warning you off, but when it has already decided. The growl rolled down the ridgeline toward me like a stone dropped into still water. Two sounds. One that almost said, help. One that meant something was about to die. I didn't know yet which one it would be. I moved toward the sound. I want to be clear about that. I moved toward it, not away. And I'm not going to dress it up as bravery or instinct or some ranger's sense of duty. The truth is simpler and stranger than that. Something in me needed to see. After everything that had happened on that trail, the silence, the broken markers, the compass drifting like a needle lost at sea, I needed to understand what was happening in these woods, even if understanding meant getting closer to something I had no business being near. Looking back, I think that curiosity might have been the most dangerous thing about me that day. The ravine opened up about 40 yards ahead. I knew this stretch, a narrow cut in the rock where the ground dropped sharply, then leveled out into a shallow basin maybe 30 feet across. Rocky, exposed. The kind of place where the canopy pulled back and you could actually see the sky, gray and heavy as wet wool. I stayed low, moving along the ridgeline above the ravine rather than dropping down into it. Old habit. You never approach a cougar from below if you can help it. You want the high ground, the angle, the ability to see what's happening before it sees you. What I saw when I reached the edge made me stop breathing. The cougar was real. A big one, a male, from the size of it, easily over 200 pounds. Tawny and compact, all coiled muscle, exactly what you'd expect to find in this part of Montana. It was moving along the far edge of the basin, low to the ground, focused entirely on something ahead of it. And that something was not an elk. It was not a deer. It was not anything I had a name for. The figure stood at the far end of the ravine, half turned away from me, half turned toward the cougar. Bipedal. Tall. Taller than any man I'd seen, and I'd seen plenty. 6.5 feet, maybe more. It was hard to judge exactly because of the way it was standing. Uneven, listing slightly to one side, putting its weight on one leg, like the other couldn't fully support it. It was covered in fur. Not hair, fur. A pale, silvery gray that caught what little light filtered down into the ravine and made it look almost luminous. Coarse and thick, the kind of coat built for cold and wet. It clung to a frame that was broad through the shoulders and chest, but thinner at the waist than a man's would be. The proportions were wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Too long in the arms, too narrow in the hips. Something between a man and something else entirely. I want to say I felt fear, and I did, eventually. But in that first moment, all I felt was a kind of dumb, absolute stillness. Like my brain had simply stopped processing and was waiting for new instructions. The cougar lunged. It was fast. God, it was fast. A blur of tawny muscle, crossing the 10 feet between them in less than a second. It hit the creature low and hard, aiming for the injured leg, the way cats do when they've already identified the weakness. The two of them went down together in a tangle of rock and dust and sound, snarling, growling, a wet, heavy impact that I felt in my chest. The creature fought back. That was the thing that kept me rooted to the ridge, watching. It didn't run. It didn't curl into itself. It swung one massive arm and caught the cougar across the side of the head. A blow that would have knocked a man unconscious. The cat twisted, recovered, sank its teeth into the creature's forearm. Blood, dark, almost black in the gray light, sprayed across the pale fur and the rocks beneath them. I'd seen cougars fight. I'd seen bears fight. I'd never seen anything like this. The creature was losing. That much was clear. The injured leg was failing it, and the cougar knew it. The cat was fast and precise, circling, lunging, always targeting the same weak point. The creature blocked what it could, but it was slowing down. Each time it rose a little less steadily. Each time it swung, the swing carried a little less force. It was going to die. Right there, 20 yards from where I was standing, it was going to die. And I was watching it happen. That's when the dogs came. They came from the east side of the ravine, out of the tree line, out of the shadow, out of nowhere. A pack. 7, maybe 8 of them. Feral dogs, the kind that accumulate in backcountry like a slow infection. Mixed breeds, lean and scarred, moving with the kind of coordinated aggression that tells you they've hunted together before. I'd heard reports of feral packs in this region for years. Other rangers had seen them. I'd seen signs, scat, torn-up campsites, tracks in the mud. But I'd never seen them like this, moving together, purposeful, like they already knew exactly what they were coming to do. They didn't hesitate, didn't circle or posture or test the situation the way wolves might. They just hit the scene, pouring into the ravine from multiple angles, splitting immediately between the cougar and the creature. Half went for the cat, half went for the wounded thing on the ground. The cougar reacted first. It's what cats do. They assess, they calculate, they decide in a fraction of a second whether a fight is still worth fighting. The cougar took one look at the dogs closing in on it and made its decision. It disengaged from the creature with a snarl, not retreating so much as redirecting, turning its fury on the nearest dog and sending it sprawling with a single swipe. But it didn't press the fight. It backed toward the tree line, hackles up, growling low. A warning, not a challenge. The dogs let it go. They had bigger prey now. 3 of them were on the creature before it could get its balance back. It was already on the ground, bleeding from a dozen places, that injured leg folded beneath it at an angle that made my stomach turn. One dog locked its jaws on the creature's arm, the same arm the cougar had already torn open. Another went for the throat. The third was circling, looking for an opening, patient in the way feral animals are patient when they know the outcome is already decided. The creature swung out with its free hand, a desperate, uncoordinated strike that caught one of the dogs across the muzzle and sent it yelping back. But it was slowing. The blood loss alone should have put it down by now. The fact that it was still moving, still fighting, still swinging back, that told me something about what this thing was. Something about the kind of body it had. Something built to survive damage that would have killed a man 3 times over. I watched all of this from the ridge above, watched and did nothing. And I need to sit with that for a moment before I tell you what happened next, because the truth is, I almost stayed frozen, almost let it play out. Almost. What moved me? What finally broke through the stillness and turned my body into action wasn't heroism. It wasn't compassion, not exactly. It was something more visceral than that. The creature had looked up at me, just once, in the chaos of the dogs tearing at it. It had lifted its head and found me on the ridge with its eyes, dark, deep-set eyes that were too bright, too aware, too present to belong to an animal. And in that single glance, I saw something I couldn't ignore. Recognition. Not surprise, not the blind, reflexive fear of a cornered animal spotting a human. Something else. Something that understood what I was, where I was, and what it meant that I was watching. That look is the thing I come back to, even now, especially now, because it changed everything that came next. I pulled the flare gun from my belt, not for the creature, not even for the cougar, for the dogs. Feral packs respond to sudden, loud, bright stimuli. It's one of the few reliable things you can count on with them. They spook, they scatter. It's temporary, but temporary was all I needed. I aimed high, above the ravine, toward the tree line where the dogs had come from. The flare gun kicked in my hand, and the signal shot arced upward in a bright, screaming streak of red and white, exploding against the gray sky like a wound opening up. The effect was immediate. The dogs broke, all of them, simultaneously, as if someone had cut a string. The one at the creature's throat released and stumbled back, ears flat, eyes wild. The others followed, not running in panic, but moving fast, deliberately, back toward the shadows they'd come from. Within seconds, they were gone, swallowed by the tree line as if they'd never been there at all. The ravine went quiet again, that same heavy, pressed-down silence I'd been carrying with me for miles. And then I looked down at the creature. It wasn't running either. It didn't move. That was the first thing I registered, the absolute stillness of it. After everything I'd just witnessed, all that violence and desperate, bloody struggle, the creature simply stopped, like a machine whose power had been cut. It was lying on its side in the loose gravel of the ravine floor, one arm folded beneath it at an awkward angle, the other stretched out in front of it. Fingers, and they were fingers, not claws, not paws. Fingers, curled loosely against the rock. I stood on that ridge for a long time before I climbed down. Longer than I'd like to admit. The rational part of my mind, the part that had kept me alive for 19 years in these woods, was telling me to leave. Walk back the way I came. Find cell signal. Call it in. Let someone else figure out what this thing was and what to do about it. That was the smart move, the safe move. But I'd already seen its eyes, and I already knew I wasn't going to walk away. I descended the ridge carefully, picking my way down the loose shale, keeping my eyes on the creature the entire time. It didn't react to my movement, didn't flinch, didn't growl, didn't shift its weight. The only sign that it was still alive was the slow, uneven rise and fall of its chest, breathing that came in shallow, wet pulls, like each one cost something it couldn't afford to spend. Up close, it was worse than it had looked from above. The cougar had done serious damage to its forearm, a deep gash that ran from the elbow almost to the wrist, the fur around it matted and dark with blood that had already begun to dry in the cold air. The dogs had added to it, bite marks along the shoulder, the side of the neck, one long tear across the ribs that exposed something pale and glistening beneath the fur. The injured leg, the one it had been favoring before the fight, was swollen badly at the knee, the fur there stiff and discolored. Old damage, I thought. Something that had happened before today. I crouched about 4 feet away from it, close enough to see, far enough to move if I needed to. My hand stayed on the flare gun, though I'd already reloaded it without thinking. Muscle memory. And then it turned its head and looked at me. Not the desperate, wild glance from the ridge. This was different. Slow, deliberate. Its eyes moved from my face to my hands to the flare gun and back to my face, tracing the details the way a person does when they're trying to figure out if they can trust what they're seeing. The eyes themselves were striking. Dark brown, almost black, but with a depth to them that caught light in a way that made them seem almost liquid. Too intelligent, too focused for anything I'd ever seen in the wild. There was no aggression in them, no fear either. Or if there was fear, it was buried deep, underneath layers of something else. Pain, yes. Exhaustion. But also a kind of quiet assessment that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was reading me. I was certain of that. As certain as I'd ever been of anything in my life. I stayed still, kept my breathing even, kept my hands visible, an old trick for dealing with skittish animals, though I'd never used it on anything like this. Minutes passed. The creature's gaze didn't waver. Then I did something I still can't fully explain. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the way it had looked at me on the ridge, that single, unmistakable flash of understanding. Maybe I just needed to do something, anything, to break the silence that had been suffocating me for the better part of an hour. I unclipped my water flask from my belt. Slowly, deliberately. Held it up so the creature could see it clearly. Then I pointed to the flask, pointed to the water inside it, pointed back to the creature. "You're thirsty. You need water. I have water." Simple, wordless, the kind of gesture a child might make. The creature blinked. Once. Its gaze dropped to the flask, held there for a moment, then came back up to my face. And then it nodded. Not a twitch, not a reflex, a nod, slow, unmistakable, deliberate. The kind of nod a person gives when they understand exactly what you're offering. I opened the flask and set it on the ground between us, then pushed it forward with my fingertips and stepped back. The creature watched me retreat. Then, with an effort that visibly cost it, every muscle in its body tensing, a low sound escaping its throat that was almost, but not quite, a groan. It reached out and pulled the flask toward itself. It drank, carefully, holding the flask in both hands the way a man would, tilting it just enough to let the water flow. When it finished, it set the flask down gently, and looked at me again. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't an animal. Whatever it was something else entirely. Something that understood. Something that could think. Something that was trusting me. The light was fading by the time I understood what it was trying to tell me. We'd been sitting in that ravine for over an hour. The creature hadn't moved, couldn't move, really, not with the leg the way it was, and the blood still seeping slowly from the gash on its arm. But it hadn't stopped watching me either. Those dark, liquid eyes followed every shift of my weight, every movement of my hands, tracking me the way I'd seen wolves track a trail, not with aggression, but with absolute, unwavering attention. I kept waiting for something to change, for the aggression to come, or the fear, or some flash of the wild thing I knew it had to be underneath all that strange, quiet stillness. It never did. And that unsettled me more than the violence in the ravine ever had. I needed to find shelter before dark. That much was obvious. The temperature was already dropping. That sharp, bone-deep cold that comes fast in Montana once the sun starts going down in October. I was wearing a jacket, but I hadn't packed for an overnight stay. Neither had this creature, obviously. If it stayed out here through the night, in the condition it was in, it wouldn't survive until morning. So I did something that felt, even as I was doing it, like the strangest thing I had ever done in my life. I picked up a stick, smoothed a patch of dirt beside me with my palm, and I drew. A circle first, simple, the way a child draws a sun, just a round shape in the ground. Then, beneath it, a small square, a house, or at least my rough approximation of one. I pointed to the square, then gestured around us, at the ravine, the darkening sky, the cold. Shelter. We need shelter. Is there shelter? I don't know why I expected it to work. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I was just doing it because I needed to feel like I was doing something. Some small human act in the middle of all this strangeness. Drawing pictures in the dirt like I was 5 years old. The creature watched me draw, watched my finger trace the lines in the ground. Its head tilted, just slightly, just enough to notice. And those eyes dropped to the dirt, studying the shapes with an intensity that made my chest tight. It understood. I saw it understand. The way you see someone solve a puzzle, a small shift in the expression, a micro-movement of recognition. It was there and gone in less than a second, but I saw it. Then it moved. Not all at once. The movement was slow, painful, every inch of it visible in the way its body fought against itself. It pushed itself up onto its hands first, arms trembling with the effort, the wounded one shaking badly. Then it got one knee under itself, then the other. It rose, staggering, listing hard to the injured side, and stood. It stood, and it looked at me, and it began to move deeper into the ravine, away from the trail, away from the open basin where the fight had happened, into the narrow cut where the rocks pressed close together, and the shadows had already turned to darkness. It moved slowly, deliberately, pausing every few steps to check that I was following. I followed. God help me. I followed. Into the dark, into the unknown, behind a wounded creature I couldn't name, deeper into a stretch of forest I'd walked 100 times, but had never seen like this. I want you to understand what that felt like. Not the fear, though the fear was there, quiet and persistent, like a second heartbeat. What I mean is the strangeness of it. The absolute surreality of walking behind this thing, watching it lead me somewhere I'd never been, trusting, on almost no evidence at all, that it wasn't leading me somewhere to die. But I trusted it. I don't know why. I just did. The ravine narrowed further, the walls closing in on either side until I had to turn sideways to fit through in places. The creature moved through these gaps with an ease that told me it had done this before, many times maybe. This was familiar ground for it, known territory. We walked for maybe 10 minutes before the passage opened up again, and there, tucked into the base of a massive fallen Douglas fir, half hidden by a tangle of uprooted roots and decades of accumulated debris, was a shelter. Not man-made. Not exactly. The fallen tree had created a natural roof, and someone, or something, had reinforced it. Branches had been woven between the roots, tightly enough to block the wind. Dry leaves and moss had been packed into the gaps. The ground beneath was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, old but dry, arranged with a care that spoke of repeated use. A den. That was the only word for it. A den, built by hands that understood the concept of shelter but had no tools to work with. Only patience and intelligence and time. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, looking at it, looking at what it meant. This wasn't survival instinct. This wasn't an animal burrowing into a hollow log for warmth. This was construction. This was planning. This was a mind that could look at a fallen tree and see possibility. The creature had already lowered itself inside, settling onto the bed of pine needles with a long, shuddering exhale. It looked up at me from the shadows, those dark eyes catching what little light remained. It nodded again. Once. Slowly. "Come in." I did. I didn't sleep that first night, not really. I dozed, maybe, in short, restless fragments, jerking awake every time the creature shifted beside me, or the wind found a gap in the roots overhead. Each time I opened my eyes, it was there, exactly where I'd last seen it, watching me with that same quiet, unreadable attention. Not threatening, not demanding, just present, waiting. I kept thinking about the shelter, about the way it had been built, branch by branch, layer by layer, with a precision that spoke of something more than instinct. And I kept thinking about the nod, the way it had looked at my drawing in the dirt and understood it. These weren't the actions of an animal, I knew that. But knowing it and accepting it were two very different things. By dawn, the creature's condition had worsened. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the wounds were angry, swollen, red at the edges, the kind of infection risk that would kill a man within days if left untreated. The leg was worse. The swelling had crept past the knee now, the fur around it tight and hot to the touch when I carefully pressed my fingers against it to check. It watched me examine it, didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just followed my hands with its eyes, patient and still, the way a person might sit while a doctor works. That patience, that trust, hit me harder than anything else had so far. I'm not a medic. I want to be clear about that. I know basic first aid. I've set a splint, closed a wound with butterfly bandages, treated hypothermia. But this wasn't a human body. I didn't know how it healed. I didn't know what would help and what might make things worse. I did it anyway. I cleaned the wounds as best I could with water from my flask, gone now, almost empty after the night, and strips torn from my undershirt. The gash on the arm was the worst. I packed it tight, pressing the cloth against the wound and holding it there while the bleeding slowed. The creature made a sound during this, a low, sustained note, somewhere between a groan and a breath, not quite pain, not quite language. Its fingers curled against the ground, gripping the pine needles, knuckles pale beneath the fur. Those hands. I kept coming back to them. 5 fingers, a thumb that opposed the others the way a human thumb does. The proportions were different, longer, thicker, the nails dark and broad, but the structure was unmistakable. These were hands built for gripping, for building, for making things. The same basic architecture as mine. I splinted the leg using 2 straight branches and strips of my jacket, binding them as tightly as I could manage. It wasn't clean work. It wasn't textbook, but it held, and when I tested the joint gently, the creature didn't react the way it had before, the sharp, involuntary tension that meant acute pain. Something had shifted. The pressure of the splint was helping. When I finished, I sat back on my heels and looked at it. Really looked. For the first time, without the filter of adrenaline or fear or the chaos of the ravine. The face was the hardest part. I'd known it was unsettlingly human from a distance. Up close, in the gray morning light filtering through the roots above us, the resemblance was sharper than I'd expected. And more wrong. The bone structure was human, or close enough. A broad forehead, cheekbones set high and wide, a jaw that was heavier than a man's, more pronounced, but shaped by the same logic. The skin beneath the fur, visible along the jaw, around the eyes, at the bridge of the nose, was dark, weathered, creased with lines that spoke of years spent outdoors in brutal cold. The eyes were set deeper than a human's would be, shadowed by a brow ridge that jutted forward slightly. But they were eyes. Round, expressive, alive with something that went beyond simple awareness. It was looking at me the way I was looking at it. And for a moment, just a moment, I forgot what it was. Forgot the fur and the height and the wrongness of the proportions. For a moment, I was just one conscious being looking at another. And there was something in that exchange that felt almost like recognition. Like we were seeing each other clearly for the first time. Then it blinked, and the moment passed, and I was back in the shelter beneath the fallen tree, crouched beside something that had no name and no place in any world I understood. I needed supplies, more water, food for both of us, bandages that weren't strips of my own clothing. I had maybe 6 hours of daylight left, and the hike back to my truck was at least 2 hours on foot, assuming I could retrace my route through the broken markers and drifting compass readings. That was the other thing I hadn't let myself think about yet. How I was going to find my way back here. I pointed to myself, then to the entrance of the shelter. Then I made a gesture I hoped was universal, fingers walking, then curling into a fist pressed against my chest. I'm leaving. I'm coming back. The creature watched the gesture, watched my face. Then slowly it reached out one hand, the uninjured one, and placed it flat against my forearm. Not gripping, not holding me back, just contact, warm through the fur, steady. It held my gaze for 3 full seconds. Then it let go and withdrew its hand, settling back against the pine needles with a long, quiet exhale. It understood. I was sure of it. And somewhere in that understanding, buried beneath the pain and the exhaustion and the strangeness of everything, was something that might have been hope. The 3rd day was when everything changed again. I'd made 2 trips back by then. The first time, I retraced my route carefully, marking every turn with fresh cairns, noting the compass drift at each waypoint. It took me longer than it should have. The forest felt different on the way out, like it was rearranging itself behind me, closing gaps, shifting shadows. I told myself it was the stress, the lack of sleep, the adrenaline still burning through my system. But the trail markers I'd placed on the way out were exactly where I'd left them. So either the forest wasn't moving, or it was only moving when I wasn't watching. I didn't want to think about which one frightened me more. I reached my truck by late afternoon, drove into town, and bought what I needed without drawing attention. Water, dried meat, bandages, proper ones, the kind that actually hold, a small first aid kit. I told no one where I was going or why. The thought of explaining any of it, the silence, the broken markers, the creature, the shelter, made something in my chest tighten. Not shame, exactly. Something closer to protectiveness. I didn't want anyone else to know, not yet, maybe not ever. I couldn't have explained why, even to myself. The second trip went smoother. I found the shelter exactly where I'd left it, the creature inside, awake, watching the entrance as I ducked through. It tracked my movements as I unpacked the supplies, those dark eyes following each item as I laid it out on the ground between us. Water, meat, clean bandages. It didn't reach for any of it until I pushed the water flask forward and gestured toward it. Same ritual as before, the same quiet nod, the same careful, deliberate way of holding the flask, like it understood that this was an exchange, that something was being offered and something was being received, and both of those things mattered. I changed the bandages on the arm wound. It was healing, slowly but visibly. The angry red at the edges had faded to pink. The swelling in the leg had come down enough that I could loosen the splint slightly without the creature tensing up. Progress. Small, measurable, real progress. By the third morning, I'd settled into something close to a routine. Wake up in the shelter. I'd started staying overnight, sleeping fitfully against the wall of roots while the creature dozed across from me. Check the wounds, change the dressings, share the water. Sit in silence while the light moved through the canopy overhead. The silence between us had changed. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of the first day in the ravine. It was something else now, comfortable almost. The kind of silence that exists between two people who don't need words to understand each other. I'd started talking to it anyway. Not about anything important, just filling the air. Telling it about the trail, about the weather, about the elk I'd seen on the way in. It listened, or at least it seemed to listen. Its head would tilt when my tone changed. Its eyes would sharpen when I pointed at something outside the shelter. Small responses, quiet acknowledgments. It was the most natural thing in the world, and the most impossible. On the morning of the third day, I was packing my kit to make another supply run when the creature moved. Not the slow, painful shuffle I'd grown used to. This was sudden, a sharp, full-body tension that ran through it like an electric current. Its head snapped toward the entrance of the shelter, ears, small, flat, almost invisible beneath the fur, pressed back against its skull. Every muscle locked, every breath held. I froze. I'd learned over the past 2 days to trust its reactions. It had senses I didn't have. It heard things I couldn't hear, felt vibrations in the ground that my boots couldn't detect. When it went still like this, something was wrong. "What is it?" I whispered. Stupid question. It couldn't answer me. But the habit of speech was hard to break, even here. The creature didn't look at me. It was staring at the entrance, at the sliver of daylight beyond the roots, with an intensity that made the air in the shelter feel suddenly, sharply cold. Then I heard it too. A hum. Low and mechanical, barely audible at first, the kind of sound that registers more as a vibration than a noise. It grew slowly, steadily, moving through the trees above us. I knew what it was before I even saw it. A drone. My blood went cold in a way it hadn't since the first day of silence on the trail. Because drones out here meant one thing, and it wasn't the ranger service. We used helicopters, we used radios, we didn't use drones. I crawled to the entrance and peered out, keeping low, keeping still. Through a gap in the roots, angled upward, I could see it. A small quadcopter, matte black, moving in a slow, deliberate grid pattern through the canopy. Survey pattern. Someone was mapping this area. Someone with money and equipment and a reason to stay hidden. Hunters. Illegal hunters. The kind that use technology to find trophy animals in places where the law can't easily follow. I'd seen their work before. Bears taken out of season, elk left to bleed out on ridgelines. I knew what they were capable of. But this was worse than trophy hunting. This was systematic. They were looking for something specific. I pulled back from the entrance and turned to the creature. It was already moving, pushing itself up, ignoring the pain, gripping the roots above it to haul itself to standing. The splinted leg held, barely. It locked eyes with me, and in that single look, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not fear, not exactly. Something more calculated than fear. An urgency that was almost commanding. It moved toward the back of the shelter, toward a narrow gap between two fallen trunks that I hadn't noticed before, or had dismissed as a dead end. It stopped there and looked back at me. The same gesture as before, in the ravine. The same silent instruction. Follow me. I didn't hesitate this time. The creature led me through passages I never would have found on my own. Not trails. There were no trails here. Just gaps between rocks, spaces between roots, narrow corridors where the forest pressed so close together that the branches interlocked overhead like fingers laced in prayer. It moved through them with a certainty that told me it had walked these routes 1,000 times. Every step placed exactly where it needed to be. Every turn taken without hesitation, without looking back, except to check that I was still behind it. I followed in silence. The drone's hum had faded behind us within minutes, swallowed by the density of the trees. But I didn't relax. The creature didn't either. It kept moving, kept checking, kept leading me deeper into a part of the forest I had never seen in 19 years of ranging this territory. We walked for maybe 20 minutes before the passage opened up onto a ridge I didn't recognize. The view stopped me in my tracks. A wide, sweeping panorama of the valley below, all dark green and gray stone, untouched, uncharted. No roads, no clearings, no sign that any human being had ever set foot in this place. The creature stopped beside me. For the first time since we'd left the shelter, it turned and looked at me fully. Not with urgency this time. Not with the sharp, commanding focus of the escape. Something quieter. Something almost final. I knew in that moment what was coming. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. We stayed on that ridge until dusk. I cleaned and redressed its wounds one last time. The arm was healing well now, the angry red almost gone, new skin knitting beneath the bandages with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. The leg was bearing weight again, tentatively, the splint holding firm. Whatever this creature was, its body knew how to repair itself, faster than mine ever would. It ate the last of the dried meat I'd brought, drank the water, sat beside me in the fading light, and for a long time, neither of us moved. I wanted to say something, some words that would have matched the weight of what had happened between us over the past week. But there were no words for this. There never could have been. Some things exist outside of language entirely, and maybe that's what made it bearable. On the 7th day, I woke alone. The shelter was empty. The pine needles where the creature had slept were cold. It had been gone for hours, maybe longer. My water flask sat near the entrance, cleaned and capped. The first aid kit was closed and set neatly beside it. Everything I'd brought, returned, arranged with care. I sat there for a long time, in the gray morning light, looking at the empty space where it had been, feeling the absence of it like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Then I packed up and walked out. The trail back was different. Not visibly. The markers I'd placed were still standing, the route technically the same. But the forest felt emptied somehow, hollowed out, like something essential had been removed from it, and what remained was just the shape of the thing, without the substance. I found my compass on the trail about a mile from the trailhead, sitting on a flat rock, right where the path curved east. I picked it up and held it in my palm, turning it slowly. The needle was steady, perfectly, precisely steady, pointing north without a flicker, without a drift, without any of the lazy, searching movement I'd watched for days. I tapped the glass, held it flat, waited. Nothing changed. It was calibrated, exactly, impossibly calibrated, better than it had been before any of this started. I closed my hand around it and stood there on the trail, alone, in the silence of the woods, and I didn't know what to feel. I looked up toward the ridge, the one where we'd sat together in the fading light, the one with the view of the valley that had no name on any map. I couldn't see it from here. The trees were too thick, the terrain too broken. But I knew where it was, or I thought I did. That evening, back in my cabin, I tried to find it on the map, traced the route I'd taken, marked the waypoints, calculated the distance. The geography didn't match. The ridge I remembered didn't exist in any place my map said it should. I checked again, and again. The numbers didn't work. The terrain didn't line up. It was as if the place had simply folded itself out of reach. But the compass still points there. Every time I hold it, no matter where I am, the needle drifts, just slightly, just barely, toward that ridge, toward something that shouldn't be there, toward something that is. I've told this story to no one, until now. And I need to ask you something, not as a ranger, not as someone trying to convince you of anything, just as a man sitting here late at night, trying to make sense of the one week in his life that changed everything. Did it happen the way I think it did? Or is there something else? Something I'm still not seeing? If any part of this story stayed with you, if you felt even a fraction of what I felt on that ridge, then stay. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think happened out there. Tell me what I might be missing. Because I've been sitting with this alone for months now, and I think I need to know I'm not the only one who believes it. And if there are more stories like this one, more things hidden in the places where the maps stop making sense, then maybe we need to keep looking. Together. Subscribe. Stay close. Because I don't think the woods are done with me yet. And I don't think they're done with you either.